Eh, Muy bienvenidos a este seminario. Me sumo a las palabras de Chris, por supuesto, especialmente en el recuerdo de Karen Poniatchik, que dirigió el Centro de Columbia durante mucho tiempo y creyó en este proyecto. Me acuerdo cuando lo decidimos con ella. También a ella le llamó mucho la atención una encuesta que hacemos en AthenaLab, donde cuando preguntamos por las amenazas que veían los chilenos, el público general puso el cambio climático muy alto y los expertos lo pusieron muy bajo. Entonces había una brecha muy grande y Karen siempre buscó la explicación, y parte de buscar esa explicación es este seminario en que ustedes están presentes. Así que me sumo a su recuerdo, especialmente en este Día Internacional de la Mujer, porque Karen, a través de su vida, rompió muchos techos de cristal en el ámbito privado, ¿cierto?
Broke down many gaps also in the public area as a minister, so I think she's a great example, and we hereby dedicate this conference to her. I would also like to thank the partners for Colombia who will be coming, and we hope that this project will be repeating itself. One of the interesting things that we will listen today is we see academicians here, militaries, decision makers, politicians, and this correctly speaks about the integral way how climate change has to be dealt with. We can't face this in the different sectors separately. It's existential and it covers the entire humanity, so we need to include all these visions and contributions to look at the impacts and the impacts specifically in security and safety. And this panel that Chris has already talked about, which is scientific and political dialogue about climate change in Latin America. We will have different invitations and different guests. We are in a hybrid confirmation. There are people here present physically and few people online. Francisco Javier Meza is physically present here, professor of the agronomy faculty of agronomy of the Universidad Católica, and one of the authors of this book, Climate Change in Chile, which is highly recommended and is a work of reference today, at least for us it is. Francisco, welcome. And we would also like to invite to get on stage Juan Jobet, ex-Minister of Energy, today Dean of the Faculty of Business of the Adolfo Ibáñez University, with great experience in energy transition. We had a course in the United States in December last year, and the teacher or the professor who taught her about climate change mentioned Juan Pablo Jobet specifically, and in Chile as an example in energy transition. But first of all, we will have Dr. Susana Adamo. She is an academician of Columbia University, and her presentation will be about vulnerability and climate variability in Latin America, migration, and demographic change. Welcome, and we hope that we can see her there online. I think we have a problem. Yes, there we can hear her. Well, like I said, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this important event. I am joining from New York at the Columbia Center. I will talk about vulnerability and variability of climate change in Latin America, demographic changes, which is a very broad topic, and lots of research has taken place in the past years. And I will present some points which I think are interesting to start a debate and discussion on the relationship between these different elements. I won't go deep into the characteristics of the impacts on climate change because I understand that Walter will be talking about that. So first, when we talk about vulnerability and variability in climate and demographic change, we're talking about a connection between processes that are taking place at different levels and in different disciplines, which implies that there has to be an interdisciplinarity. And in general, these elements get together through a certain risk theory where exposure and vulnerability are pre-existing conditions that determine in certain way, together with the characteristics of the event involved, what will be the result of that impact. And mobility and migration are considered one of the possible results of that process. When we talk about vulnerability related to climate change, Intergovernmental Partner of Climate Change has issued several reports and mentions the need to work with a vulnerability that is multi-dimensional, with more dimensions, and it's just not only about poverty and lack of resources, but it's broader. And at the same time, it is rooted in an intersectional this inequality, which are based on characteristics or demographic features such as age, gender, also race, ethnia, demographic condition, and they're not alone, they're an individual, they're not interrelated, and this can give or can lead to more different vulnerabilities, and Latin America is one of the most unequal regions, so that can be one of the reasons to get out of this position of vulnerability, of impact. It is never determined by one single element, not just one single determinant. They always are together, or several elements, and this has been studied for a long time already. So one of the challenges is to understand what the role is that the climate factors can have because of climate change, of climate variability, in the decision to migrate or the decision to stay. And that is, if there is important, the work that we have done in this research to determine the impact that climate factors can have in migration, directly or indirectly, and what is being threatened. We're talking about a threat to life, health, sustainability, means of life, etc. So that is important. But supposing that the result is migration, we've also got this question: how the destination is chosen, where people go to in this migration. And here the existence of pre-existing migration systems come into place. For Latin America, there are interregional systems. There's movement between countries in Latin America, extra-regional, moving to Europe or the United States and Canada. But there is also internal migration. And what we've studied so far is that these pre-existing networks of migration are important to be able to understand where the migrants are headed. In that sense, in Latin America, internal gaps have always been very important, but there's always also been an increase in interregional migration and extra-regional migration for several reasons. And up to today, it's being studied what the relative importance is of climate factors and other environmental factors in choosing the destination. It's also important to understand here what the importance is of institutional factors in terms of what the regulations are of migratory movements. But apart from that, and when we go back to demographic change, migration is one of the basic demographic aspects. Migration is important to understand why the distribution of a population at a certain point is the one that it is, and especially for Latin America, what have been the urbanization processes the region has gone through. And in that sense, Latin America is a highly urbanized region, the most urbanized of the world. And in these processes of urbanization, especially at the beginning, the migration processes are very important from the rural areas to the city, and then from one city to the other, due to this pre-existing matrix of certain localization of migrants to certain cities. Another research topic has come up, which is cities as destinations, as migrations, but also cities exposed to climate change and the possibility that these migrations take place, the secondary migrations take place. Not only Latin America is a highly urbanized region, but also many of these cities are located in areas that are much exposed or can be much more exposed in the future to the effects of climate change, among which is the rise of the sea level. Many cities are close to the coast, and there are also areas where the effect of the heat rays is going up, and also places where there is more drought and the lack of water. In that sense, these pre-existing patterns of migration to these cities can, on one hand, increase especially when it's a quick migration in the cities, but also cities can have places where there are climate effects. At the same time, migrants, especially the recent migrants, can be a vulnerable group in the areas of destination of the cities, particularly because migrants can be exposed to different ways of informality because of the place where they live, because of informal settlements, but also depending on the conditions in which the migrants get to the cities. They can be more likely to be working in informal sectors, and because of this informality, this double informality, the need to be close to work, it can also make that they settle down in cities that are less insecure in terms of climate. And the last thing I would like to mention is something that's been coming up strong, hand in hand with the perspectives of environmental justice, which have been very much highlighted in the latest report of the IPCC, which is the perspective of human rights, which basically seeks to look at the migrant as a person and not migration as a phenomenon at the center of governance, and to assure the rights of these displaced people due to climate change, especially those who are in situations that have a situation where they have had to be moved for a long time. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Susana, for your presentation. And now we will listen to Dr. Walter Baethgen, also of Columbia University, who will talk about the assessment of risks of climate change in Latin America. Thank you. Good morning. Can you hear me well? Yes, very well. First of all, good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to also commemorate Karen, who was a great person. Personally, as a father of 4 daughters and a brother of 4 sisters, On a day like today, Karen also represented a reference, and that's why I consider women important. We'll talk about climate change. The first thing I would like to mention is that we shouldn't forget what are the causes of climate change. The causes of climate change, 70% of the emissions of greenhouse gases, which are emitted every year, 70% still comes from fossil fuels. I would really like to emphasize this because recently it has become very fashionable to talk about other things, the food systems, many things that are close to human feelings and sensations. But let's not forget that 70% of greenhouse gases is responsible for climate change, and it still comes from fossil fuels. The second great topic I would like to talk to about today, what's the impact of climate change? For many years, and we're still seeing this, climate change was focused on trying to determine what the climate will be in the future. What will happen with temperature in the different countries in the world in 2080, in 2070, what will happen with rainfall in 2060, in 2070. These are things that were very important at some point, and they really made people aware, and the society aware, that there are things that we have to change in our development models, because the impacts we're feeling of climate change are too great. So we focus a lot on the future, but on a very far away future, on a future difficult to incorporate in daily decisions. It's difficult to incorporate them into public policies because it's focused on a period of time that's very far away from when people who work in public policies are working on them. Fortunately, the latest report of IPCC, the panel that gets all the climate panels together, the latest report emphasizes what is happening right now. There is absolute scientific, robust evidence that global warming caused by the emissions of greenhouse gases is already more frequent and more intense in terms of extreme events, such as heat waves, extreme events such as great floods, droughts. And this is happening today. And I think this helps to change the focus on climate change. We should not think in the future that's so far ahead, but think essentially, what can we do today? What can we do today to fight the causes, and what can we do today to improve our capacity to adapt? So the second point that's very important is that transition to look at climate change as a problem of today and not a problem of the future for those who will be replacing us. This, of course, this frequency and intensity of extreme events has immediate impacts on things such as the disasters that I've just mentioned, the food uncertainty, threats to public health, for example, floods that cause diseases. And at the same time, like Susana mentioned, this creates instability. And of course, the degree of instability created by these phenomena depends on the ability that exists in the country. It depends on how each country is prepared to face each one of these extreme events. And that's the third point I want to mention. The third point, I will start by an example on climate change. The war in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia. That has a great impact, a global impact, but it has completely different impacts in different countries. That range of impacts has been considered as a record in energy export, and on the other extreme, in countries such as Yemen or Bangladesh, that depend a lot on the things that happen in Ukraine for their basic services, they have felt an enormous impact on the food safety. So, like all phenomena that have a global impact, the problems can be added. When we add climate change, the societies that suffer most from those impacts of climate change are the most vulnerable societies. It's a completely different impact of a flood or a drought in a country that has good early alert systems, good early response systems, good food distribution systems, good public health systems. Is totally different the impact that the same phenomenon associated with climate change can have on a country that has all the institutions and infrastructure weaker. So in that sense, these are phenomena that are totally unfair. They affect those who are vulnerable a lot more than the countries or societies that are more resilient, more developed. The fourth point related to this is that probably this climate change is one of the things that we're going through right now. What do I mean? I was saying that 70% of emissions of greenhouse gases come from fossil fuel. Well, if we add the emissions of China, United States, and Europe, those three regions of countries and a region are responsible for more than 50% of the emissions of greenhouse gases. And Africa, the total Africa, Latin America, is responsible for less than 5%. However, climate change, extreme events affect the countries in the same way, wherever they are. However, the impact of a drought suffered, for example, in Kenya is completely different from a drought that might happen in California or even in Uruguay, a country of medium income. It's completely different. A month ago, I was in Kenya and I hadn't seen such an atrocious impact of a drought on the food production in a country. So that is the fourth point that I wanted to highlight in this panel. Well, all those points are depressing. All those points show us a bleak future, something unfair. I would like to finalize with an opposite point, and this is that this is also discarding opportunities. Climate change, fortunately, is a very popular topic. Everybody talks about climate change. Everybody does things for climate change when we think about things in a wrong way sometimes. But it's very good that all this general awareness is there, that climate change is a real problem, and this is generating opportunities. For example, we're talking about Uruguay. The government has and the private sector have dedicated themselves to designing systems for food products that have least environmental waste possible. Why? Because there is awareness, they are conscious that they want to contribute to fighting the problems global, but also because Uruguay is a country that exports food. They produce 3 times more than their internal population. So they know that there are market niches that are looking for products with these characteristics of low food waste, and that can doing away with possibilities of doing things better. As for Uruguay, 100% of electricity countries that are trying to produce food with a low environmental footprint. So these are the 3 or 4 concepts that I wanted to talk about, to discuss, and I'm very, very thankful for the opportunity.
Now we have, will speak Dr. Francisco Javier Meza from the Catholic University. Francisco, go ahead, please. Yes, perfect. It works well. Thank you so much. I will put a timing clock here. Okay, first of all, thank you very much for your invitation. It is a pleasure to be able to share with this panel members, and also, if we're still online, to say hello to Walter Baethgen, who we are friends now for many years. My excuses for the ones who do not are native in Spanish, but I can express myself a little better in Spanish than in English, so that I hope this works well. It is a challenge to talk about climate change for the ones who we've been so long in this because of course there's almost a trend that we should look at this from starting from greenhouse gases emissions, the alteration of the planet's energy, and then also an implication on the weather or climate. We, as an instrument or tool, we use simulation models, computers that tell us which will be the behavior, the variable climate variables in the future, according to the different issues. But I will try to do something a little bit different today. I will mention a collective experiment that we will carry out, and we will go to our imagination and our perception. So I will invite all of you, since you're all more or less older than 10 years, you can look at the previous 10 years of the reality within the country. Okay? This has been the 10 driest years that the central area of Chile has had. Up to such point that I would say there isn't a record. The records we have from 1800s. If we would go back further, we might find evidence of this nature. But this has been the biggest and longest drought. Not the most intense, but the longest drought that we have since we have any type of records. This is more or less if we were a company and we had consecutively have red figures or red numbers or red results. If we were students, no, you get a bad grade. It could happen, right? But if in the last 12 tests you have a negative outcome, it's suspicious, right? Another example, if you were players of a soccer team in San Vicente Tahuatahua and you would beat Colo Colo in the last 6 matches, you would also say this is something suspicious, right? Yes. That's what we're living today. There are reasons to be able to lay out what's happening in the last few years climate-wise. Yes, there's a La Niña phenomenon that has been present. It's true that we have a warm spot in the Pacific Sea. A research of co-workers that are doing from the University of Chile. But I look at this and I say, you know what? This is a signal maybe of a larger trend, right? And I want to bring you to my area. My area is not so much a climate, but it translates climate within different areas or different sectors. When you have 10 consecutive years of a drought, very interesting things happen. Like, for example, that our most important drinking water company starts getting very nervous. And they have to start saying, we must do something here. They have done investments for one thing related to climate change, which has to do with settling ponds for extreme events, and that way to assure the continuity of supplies, water supply. But when you have 10 years of consecutive drought, you start saying, why don't we interact closely with the other users of the water from Santiago and see how we can help each other, because we're at the borderline. Rio Maipo is very interesting. Rio Maipo has the Maipo River has a flow. In January, it could have more than 100 cubic meters per second. And if you take this in averages of the entire years at the water supply for all users, urban users, agricultural and industrial users, it has been enough. Currently, we find ourselves in a situation that if it continues, we must be intelligent to manage the basis and allocate resources in a different way. We must invest in efficiency, we must invest in new sources, and we have to reduce demand in a substantial way. 10 or 12 years of drought means that vegetation has adapted itself to drier conditions than our Mediterranean ecosystem. We're trying to build a drought index based on vegetation, not mineralogy, that could let us know the different species, right? What's really happening? Are we losing an amount of vegetation, which is surprising, with the impact of the ecosystem, with the impact in the water regulation, impacts in biodiversity, which are very large, and they will generate many issues. Wildfire seasons. This has been one of the most active ones. Regarding this climate change, Walter is totally right. These are phenomena that empower themselves. I'm not saying that climate change or what we're currently living is responsible of the forest fires or wildfires. A great part of them are from a human cause, with intention. How do they propagate? It has to do with the area, how we use the area, and the size they get to. That's considered with the climate. So this is a swing. If the mom's pushing, but then the big brother comes in and says, "I'll help you," and pushes the swing a lot harder. Yeah, I stopped. At the end, I fell to the ground. So therefore, we have fires of 400,000 hectares that were lost. That's to put it in a different perspective. That's a huge problem when we want to mitigate climate change. The neutral carbon strategy says that fortunately we have woods and natural ecosystems that can capture. So therefore what we have to do is to deviate until what we emit is what we can capture. That is the strategy. And probably a cost-efficient strategy. I have my doubts of how ambitious it is, but we are at ease in that layer, which is the ecosystem. In the year 2017 was the first time that the forestry sector was a net emitter, because we have fires of this size. So that's enough, so our carbon neutral strategy is committed. So what we are currently living is the most biggest and scariest exercise of the climate change. It's that. The heat waves, vegetation that develops itself ahead of time, transmission of diseases, issues in the supply of resources. We're not at a level that we're committing food security, but since water is one of the main things, agricultural activity without water, it would be less efficient and less productive, and of course will not be capable of exporting it, but possibly to supply one of these basic goods for our population. We can give you different numbers. As an example, Puerto Montt, an area that for us is a rainy area, right, of around 1,800 millimeters per year, has lost 40% of their rain drop during summertime. It's fantastic for tourism. The people in the Los Lagos region, they had few days of rain. The issue is that the hills, the vegetation, the rhythm in which glaciers and snow melt, it changes. So we should look at this very, very slowly, because it is the most iconic way that we will be able to anticipate climate change. I have 2 minutes left. I know that I excuse myself, but for the people who are not who are looking us via streaming, here there's a slide, Atlas of Climate Risks. Chile has a scientific strength that's very interesting in climate change. There's thinking centers that do things not of the size that the Columbia University could do. So welcome to all the alliances and all the type of cooperation. That possibility really gets us enthusiastic about it. And the Ministry of Environment is one of the most trained person in climate change. But apart, the public sector, the Environmental Ministry, Agricultural Ministry, and the Public Works Ministry have also been, in some ways, they've been pushing of generating knowledge regarding climate change. Why? Because we must deliver updates, national information, a status of how our environmental system is, and we have been doing this for the last 10 years. Around 2018, 2019, we intend to introduce this for Co-op 25, that supposedly was in Santiago, and then at the end it was carried out in Madrid, and we carried out this Atlas of Climate Risks. And I invite you to look at this, and you can see the magnitude of what we did. We coordinated the work of different stakeholders. There are 31 research centers that provided information and made it available. These are the things that we were able to do within 1 year. We worked with threat indicators for the future and the present for climate change. We worked in 12 areas: agricultural, forestry, resources, water resources, electrical infrastructure, mining, port systems. As I say, it's not perfect, but it's close to what I thought about. There could be certain criticism, but it's a base of information that's systemized that we had never had before. We had this in paper, but in paper it's difficult to process this. Now we can download terabytes of data and many things can be done. I had the opportunity of being the inauguration of the Military Polytechnic Academy, and the challenge is to connect climate change with your day-to-day, the logistics, the security issues you will have. Each one has that task, and here there's a world of information. 30 seconds. I've been over time now. I've been extending myself. An idea. It just came to my Eduardo Galeano. I don't know if it belongs to him, but it comes with a video about talking about utopia. But in Tendencies, Eduardo Galeano says utopia is there up front, far away, right? And I move 2 steps, and utopia moves ahead 5 steps. I try to go ahead 10 steps further, and it keeps getting away from me. So the question is, why is utopia for? It is useful for that, to walk. Climate change is a bit the same. We won't solve this. This is not something, oh, here's the answer for this. This is technology. This is the way. No, we won't solve this. It'll be permanently challenging us because our models, our way of thinking are still limited. But it's a huge incentive to do things better every time. Energy efficiency, water efficiency, food safety, everything is touched by climate change. We always have to consider this, and this will help us. I hopefully think that we do things better each time. Thank you. Thank you very much, Francisco, for your presentation and for sharing this Atlas of Climate Risks. This could be seen in the webpage, I imagine. It's in the portal of the Environmental Ministry in arclim.mda.gov.cl. So it's available for anyone who wants to look at this there. Thank you for that information. And to finish now, we will have as a presenter Juan Jobet, who will talk to us about green energy transitions And then afterwards, we will have a round of Q&A round where we want the audience to participate and also the people who are online. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be here. I want to add myself to the memory of Karen Ponicic. I sat in the same position as her in the mining ministry. Also, I'm a father of all daughters that have opened the way for other women. It's just a point open to admire. What I would try to do is basically to talk about energy transition and green energy transition, and I will mention some possible implications for the safety of the region. Even though I said I'm an expert in safety, but I will mention two possible safety implications that I see as safety or security in the national safety or all the governments, but also in a more human, in people's lives. And I think it is important when we talk about energy transition to understand that energy transition in its essence has to do how do we stop using or consuming fossil fuels, which are responsible for 70% of the greenhouse gases, how we stop using fossil fuels and we start using renewable energy as energy sources. And that process in different countries is a bit different, but in essence it's all the same. It has to do with producing a lot of electricity or power from wind or sun and other renewable resources, and they use that clean energy in order to replace everything we do in our economies and transportation with electromobility in our homes, heating our houses or cooling our houses with heat pumps, right? And that way also in industries. That is like the framework which I will mention. And the more general type of question is how can we achieve this transition, this energy transition? Getting the benefits that it has, basically reducing emissions, but minimizing the potential negative effects of that transition has in terms of environmental, economically, and others. And the last thing I want to say is a framework to talk about Latin America. It's hard because Latin America, there are many diverse countries. Sometimes when you look at Latin America far away, it's seen as a homogeneous package. And all the countries in Latin America are different. I will talk about implications using Chile, but being aware that Chile is not the same as all the rest of the countries. This has to do with the effect that this energy transition will have for the countries who are large oil and gas producers, which are many in the region. We have Venezuela, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina. What effect will this have in the reduction of fossil fuel demands in the economy of these countries, in the fiscal incomes of those governments, in their currency, employment, etc., etc.? It's not an issue that I will talk, but I think in an energy and safety agenda, it is an important issue to talk about. The first thing, and I will basically mention four areas in which I see relevant implications of this green energy transition. First of all is the phase out of fossil fuels. I believe that for the countries like Chile, who have a lot of renewable resources, that's a great part of the countries of the region have. It's good news. We will reduce our how we depend on fossil fuels. Chile, 70% of their energy needs was supplied with fossil fuels that were imported. Only 30% hydroelectricity or hydropower, some renewable energy with wind and sun, and the use of a lot of wood, specifically in the southern part of the country for heating. The rest was 100% imported fossil fuels. So when we go ahead with this energy transition, we will depend less of those imported fossil fuels, which gives us more security as a government, of course, and will also allow us to reduce volatility that fuel prices have, that have direct implications for the economical safety or security of vulnerable families. It has effects on the economy because fuels are very important key consumables, and will also have a positive impact in the government income. The government was pushing the climate agenda with a lot of strength. Last year, it put almost $3 billion, 1% of the GDP, and the mechanisms to stabilize fuel prices, basically subsidizing the use of fossil fuels. When we reduce our dependency of those fossil fuels, that will alleviate the fiscal part, and we will have more security. That will generate the loss of employment, even though it's not a very intensive industry in employment. When we close the carbon generators to replace them by renewable energies, there are people that will lose their employments. Here in Chile, they are focused in 5 areas, and they're very important for local economies. When we close those fossil fuel generators, and we can help them to convert to green energy, and we can talk about other examples. For example, electromobility. When we stop using fossil fuels in our vehicles, what happened with the people that work in that industry currently? Second is the deployment or the development of many renewable energy projects. What is the implication of this? First of all, we will have access to clean power or clean energy that's cleaner and of course cheaper, and that's good for the families and the country. It makes it more competitive and more resilient. Now, our electrical system, when we stop burning fossil fuels, we become dependent on renewable energies, which is what we want, but that also makes us more vulnerable to the effects of climate change. For example, droughts means that our capacity of power generating with hydroelectricity has suffered very much during the last few years. So it's good that we do not depend on fossil fuels, but it adds certain lack of security on our energy, because on wind, we have seen some regions of the world that the wind patterns change, giving the climate change, and that affects at the same time the resiliency of the system. The other thing that's also important to mention is that we could go ahead to a more regional integration. We could have an electrical system that's more resilient if it's connected with other countries within the region. Even though all the countries have a good resources to generate renewable energy, we have a good sun up in the north, we have good wind specifically in the south, so more regional interconnection would make Latin America as a whole to have a power system and more resilient economy. But the political economy of that integration is more complex. We had a period where we built 7 gas pipes with Argentina, and for housing and industry. As we know, that supply was interrupted, which made it difficult on the Chilean economy, and that was already left behind. There's no hard feelings with the Argentinians, but that agenda, the tensions with Bolivia, remember the statements that we will not sell any, Bolivia will not sell any gas to Chile, and the political economy for this integration is complex. But if we were able to push this in that way, to have a common electrical and energy system, that we will be more integrated. Now, migration to renewable energy that's cheaper and cleaner will allow us to be more competitive, not only in the electrical area, but also in other areas of the economy. For example, water desalination, its main consumable, its power. If we're able to produce low-cost renewable energy, we could desalinate water at low cost, not only desalinate it, but pump it from the coastal area to the valleys or to the mining companies that consume a lot of water. So therefore, we can use clean energy to have data centers. They've invested in Chile more than $2.5 billion in data centers, because moving electricity at different places in the world is expensive. To promote data is cheap. We have fiber optics networks instead of installing data center where electricity is dirty and expensive. We install it in Chile, and we move data. So to clean the energy system, to clean this out, it's like cleaning your blood. It allows you to clean all the areas of the economy. Transportation, data centers, water desalination, For example, agricultural activities. Agricultural activities are suffering by the climate change. Locations are moving towards the south, but if we're able to desalinate water, we could use hectares that are desert in the north to produce agricultural products. And we have a more of a food assurance. It is important that this development of renewable energy in different places has to be done respecting local communities and minimizing the effects on biodiversity, or else the safety of those communities will be affected. Maybe an additional point to this, in countries that are still not, they have differences, specifically Latin America, the how do we split the cost of renewable resources and infrastructure, because that we already saw that in 2019, that feeling or that perception of inequality, right, could have any consequences of what we lived during that period. So how do we distribute the costs and benefits of that transition is very important. This transition is also bringing a lot of investment, foreign investment. And we in this power generation system for 10 to 15 years ago, it was an area that was concentrated in a few stakeholders. Currently, we have many stakeholders from many countries in the world, and that strengthens our links with this country with other commercial partners. And that, of course, makes our country safer, that we have more interdependency with other economies. Those countries has a vast interest in our country, so therefore they want us to do well, and that makes a more resilient country. There are complex areas also in direct foreign investments. For example, in Chile, in the last few years, Chinese companies have bought critical infrastructure for electricity to companies that distribute more than 55% of electricity within the country belong to Chinese companies. Chile has very good regulations to take care of the end user's interest, but this is complex. What are the safeguards that we will take, if we will take them, in order to regulate the foreign investments in assets or critical infrastructure? What reaction will that create in other commercial partners? The States, for example, that has relations with other tensions with other commercial partners like China. How that geopolitical safety, I think that's an open question that we also have to consider. And of course, foreign investments has global investment institutions that are lending money to those projects, and therefore they align their interest with Chile's interest. And the last thing I want to say, considering time, I also see a point in international trade. Chile, I hope that in a few more years, could be a supplier of clean energy, for example, green ammonium from green hydrogen. We're already exporting fuels from hydrogen from Magallanes to Germany, Japan, Korea. Countries in Asia have shown a lot of interest, and also many countries from the European Union and eventually the US. And that, of course, strengthening our links with other countries in the world, but also can generate tensions. We are seeing what has happened with the IRA and Inflation Reduction Act, which is a policy that has nothing to do with inflation, but very important subsidies in order to encourage investment in green energy. But it has some restrictions, so those subsidies can be received. The products or the consumables of those electrical cars must come from partner countries, countries that are partners from the U.S. Chilean copper, for example, great part of which is processed in China, doesn't qualify, but its origin is from Chile, but it was processed or refined in China. That's generating tensions with the European Union also, that could put their position of their industry in a lesser fair condition. Between Chile, the U.S., and Europe, how do we avoid not finding ourselves in the middle in different issues with the commercial trade partners? So I believe, in summary, that the energy bring benefits in terms of safety for the region, but it has complex points that we have to review with time, and that's why I celebrate that we have moments like this, and we start thinking about this in a more systematic way, because the consequences will be seen in the short term. Thank you so much, Juan Carlos.
And now we have some time for questions. We've got 10 minutes. Questions from the audience and also the audience connected online. We will try to alternate between questions from the audience present here and from the audience online. Please, could you tell us who the question is addressed to? Good morning. My name is Sebastian Ruiz. I'm a researcher at the Catholic University in engineering. I have a question for the last speaker. I think that it's interesting for everybody. Many ideas. Transition, I know it's complex, but we know that the startup always has a very large obstacle, and it's because Chile has come to the club of political stability. So we can't forget this, and my question is, how can we, on the long term, have the agreements and necessary confidence so this is not abandoned or dropped halfway? Because, of course, lots of efforts and resources are dedicated to it. How do we see this, how can this rhyme with political instability on the long term? Do each one question at a time? There's a question from the online audience. Next question says, of all the threats and risks that are already affecting Latin America, which are the most dangerous for human life? Okay, well, I'll start with the first questions. Thank you, Sebastian, for the question. It's, of course, the million-dollar question. It's very difficult to answer, and I'll just try to say something. Political instability in Chile, of course, is a fact. It's been like that for the past years. I believe that we've talked about economy, energy transition, investment, but I think the bottleneck, of course, is the political system in Chile. We have a good system, political or good system with parties, election system, and this enables us, or enables interaction with Congress to work well. There are better public policies, people feel better represented, and I think that is a starting point for other things, of course, to flow behind that. I believe that I'm optimistic that we will be able to solve this, but we don't know, of course. So I do believe that when we talk about with foreign investors and commercial partners, sometimes political instability in Chile, I don't want to minimize it, but sometimes we look at it in a more dramatic way than it really is, and more dramatic inside than from outside. Very often foreigners understand that this is part of a process of a country that was transformed very lately, and the adaptations didn't come as fast as the adaptation of the society, and it's an adjustment process, and there is general confidence that Chileans are sensible people and moderated, and we've shown this, and that this will go into the right direction. Of course, we don't have a crystal ball, but I'm optimistic. I think that this will happen. I'm very optimistic because of the foreigners who say that Chile will do well. Any of the panel members wants to answer the other question? What threats could damage human life most? That is the question of $999,999. It's very difficult to answer, this is it, this or these are the 4, 5, 7 most difficult problems. If there is one characteristic of climate change, it is that the combination of the effect of climate with the local realities and the system make that priorities are different, right? I could say, well, for Chile, water and scarcity is one of the most important problems. But if you go to Buenos Aires, they'll say, well, we've got lots of water. Well, for us, the water problem is that we have an excess of water. So it's very difficult to say which is this one. If we establish a connection between a climate system and social system and an ecological system, and those three are vulnerable, then I think that is where our priority must lie. So if this means that climate change, deforestation, loss of biodiversity, these things enhance each other, and that's where we have to place our focus and our emphasis. So on the other hand, I think it's very complex to say, well, these are the five priority points. What if the local reality is not among these 5 points? Will I stop worrying about climate change or doing something about climate change? That's ridiculous, of course. So we constantly have to take into consideration the local context. Well, thank you very much for the answer. We would like to continue with these question and answer round, but we also have an audience that's connected, so we have to be very strict with time. We will have a brief break now of 10 minutes. Please come back soon because of all the people who are connected online. And then we will start with a second panel, which will be climate change risks and threats in regional safety, where we will continue talking about this issue. So we would like to thank Susana, Walter, Juan Carlos, Francisco for being here and for your questions. Thank you very much.